When did you get in, Karen?
Oh, I got in Thursday morning.
Okay, so you've had time to deal with the jet lag.
But I'm still jet lagged.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it?
It's really tough.
And have you gotten to many sessions?
No, I went to a few. I actually came to this one. I was in this room yesterday for
Okay.
a lot of the day.
Oh, were you on a panel here
No,
yesterday?
I was just listening. I just wanted to see
Okay,
what it
good.
was like. So
Good.
I've been kind of like dropping in and out.
Good,
of sessions.
good.
Yeah.
Right. And have you had lots of meetings while you've been here as well?
So many. All social, which is great.
Good, good,
I
yeah.
mean, some social, some business. But
And when do you go
mostly
back
social.
then?
Tomorrow morning I fly from here to London.
Okay.
And meet with the AP office in London.
Oh, lovely.
And then back to New York.
Right, good for you.
Yeah.
So when are you on a flight to New York? Do you have a day or two in London? Or?
I have 2 days in London.
Oh, good.
Maybe
Okay.
3.
Right.
And, it's just tricky.
You'll just be getting past the jet lag, and you'll starting to feel normal when it'll be time to get back on a flight again. Yeah.
I know. How long are you here for?
I only arrived last night, and I'm leaving tonight
Oh
or
my
this
gosh.
afternoon. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. So in and out.
Yeah.
So yeah, intense. But at least I don't have the jet lag problem to worry about. So there's that. It's one less thing to navigate.
I was trying to figure out what was going on next door. There's a really long line to get in.
What is it? We're obviously up against something big. Yeah, sure. Yeah. What is on 10:30? Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion about the Internet's essential workers. As most of you will know, this is a really complex space where those working inside technology platforms and trust and safety teams are dealing with acute levels of technical difficulty every day. It's emotionally draining, and it's a high-stakes game. And they're also then working with fact checkers, the likes of the company Kinzen that I co-founded with Mark Little, which is helping these people inside technology platforms detect, disrupt misinformation, disinformation, harmful speech, and helping them evolve their policies. And so we wanted to take this moment today at the International Festival of Journalism to better understand the work of those trust and safety professionals inside technology companies who ultimately have the job of amplifying, trustworthy, truthful, factual-based content, but mitigating the toxic stuff, the stuff that can do real-world harm, and to better understand the decisions, the policies, the procedures that they're having to navigate every day, and the balances that they're trying to strike between user safety and yet implementing policies for their companies that are going to ensure engagement, respect, freedom of speech. So highly complex. And we have an incredible panel of speakers here this morning. And to get us started, I wanted to ask each of you, how does your work connect to these essential workers, these trust and safety professionals, one, and two, what drives you day to day? So maybe Karen from the AP, you might get us going.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Mahabir, and I am the Director of News Talent for Staff Development at the Associated Press. Oh, hi. But up until about 2 months ago, I was the AP's...
Yeah, it's giving
It's
green
on.
here, yeah.
Can you not hear me? Sorry.
Oh, there we go. That's better now, is it? Yeah.
Better?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start over. So I'm Karen Mahabir, and I'm the Director of News Talent for Staff Development at the Associated Press. But up until about 2 months ago, I was the AP's fact check and misinformation editor, which is a position I held for about 5 years. And I think what drives me really is fact-based reporting. I think, especially in this age of misinformation and disinformation. But I think also giving our staff the tools and the resources to really develop themselves and to protect themselves in the face of some of the emotional toll that this work can take on you is extremely important to me, which is why I'm in this new role. That's how it connects.
Great. Ben?
Hi everyone, my name's Ben Whitelaw. I'm a freelance journalist and consultant, but for a decade I worked for a number of UK media companies in the audience development space. So I was very actively involved in the moderation of content on news sites. I had a team of people that did this. I'm motivated in the sense that I was working in a newsroom when Brexit happened, when the US election 2020 happened, and I saw very viscerally, even in just one context, in one website, the divisions that would come up and the difficulty of moderating content to a policy. So I come from a very kind of operational background, and I very much struggled, and my team struggled at times to do what some of these great panelists have done, which is create policies and then put them in place. So I'm looking forward to discussing that today.
And blessed you are amongst women, Ben. Katie.
Hi, everyone. My name's Katie Harbath. I currently have my own company called Anchor Change, but last year I left Facebook after 10 years. I was on the public policy team, and I built the teams that worked with governments and politicians on how to use the platform, and also coordinated the company's elections work through the end of 2019. And so I was at the front lines for many of the stories that you all are familiar with, of trying to grapple with, at first, how social media can be used in politics, and then how do we protect the integrity of elections on those platforms. And what drives me is it's not a surprise or anything to say that there were a lot of things that we probably should have done differently. And I've been thinking a lot about that, and a lot about how we can learn, what we can learn from the last 20 years of how tech has impacted democracy to think about the next 20. And so I want to be a part of trying to continue to think about those solutions and problems, and that's what drives me every day.
Great, thank you. Bahar.
Hello, everybody. This is Bahar Ozkan. I'm the Senior Director of Wellbeing and Resilience at Concentrix in Trust and Safety space. I did work in trust and safety and content moderation, every layers actually, from operations to quality to well-being. I am originally a clinical psychologist, and working in innovation, technology, and research integration to content moderation, knowing that this work is too complex, and unfortunately, the perception and what we know about content moderation in the public, in the outside, is very different than inside. The work is too complex, requires a lot of attention, requires a lot of mental health support, and that drives me to do my job every single day to close that gap between how it's seen, what it is actually in the day-to-day basis. So at the same time, as a psychologist, having the values to improve mental health and the resilience of the moderators every day is my core driving factor. So Great. It's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Katie, to start with you, top of mind for everyone this morning, we rise to meet another day here in continental Europe, war in Ukraine. Could you reflect on the last 30 days and the new precedents being set, but whether there was a playbook for this? We know platforms have playbooks now for events, for elections. Was there a playbook to meet a moment like this?
So I don't know for sure if there was a specific playbook for something like this, but it is generally harder for the platforms to have playbooks when they are on planned events or there are ones. An election is something you know is coming. It was actually kind of a luxury to be able to know it was coming and be able to prepare for it. And while there was a lead up of a couple of, some weeks about it, nobody quite knew how it was going to unfold and what was going to happen. And that does cause the companies to have to make a lot of changes as things are unfolding. I do wish that there would be a little bit more long-term planning, but as somebody who worked there, that can be very hard to find the time in which to do those types of things. But a couple of things that I saw. One was the transparency ahead of time of the disinformation that we might see was somewhat unprecedented that we saw coming from the government in trying to prepare people for the fact that there would be these false flag operations, that there would be these efforts from Russia in terms of doing it. You saw, obviously, the Ukrainian president use social media and view the fact of doing communications extremely important in terms of helping to communicate as part of the war and what was happening. And so you can tell he's very much prioritizing it and using the platforms that people on the ground are using, but also thinking about Western society and the ones that they are using. The other thing that I saw too is that kind of for the first time, instead of the tech companies, government, and civil society kind of pointing fingers at one another, being like, no, you do this, you should be doing this, and criticizing, we actually saw them all taking this different steps that they can take. The government was putting in sanctions. The tech companies were putting in various policies and trying to do this delicate dance between staying up in Russia because they're some of the only platforms that aren't controlled by Putin, but also trying not to appease him. But that is we could do an entire panel just on that type of topic of those types of things. And so you saw them having to make, and I think platforms like Facebook and Google and to some extent Twitter have dealt with this for a much longer period of time. Whereas newer platforms like TikTok or even Clubhouse or Telegram don't necessarily have the infrastructure in place to have thought about it and may have struggled with it a little bit more. And so I'll be curious to see how this continues to evolve as not only the war there goes on, but we start to see things like, okay, Russian media is banned, but now Chinese state media is starting to pick up many of these messages. It's not just happening in Eastern Europe. These false flag messages are happening in places like Latin America, Asia, and Africa as well. So a bunch of different fronts to sort of think about. But for me, this kind of feels like one of the first, outside of like what happened when the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, one of the first wars that's really being paid attention to on a daily basis in the West that is happening on the internet.
Bahar, for you in Concentrix, like Katie talked there about, like there are things that are known and you can plan for proactively, and then there's unknowables like the last 30 odd days. Like, did you guys have a state of readiness? What emotional toll has it taken for your staff? But also, what have you just seen playing out then amongst the audience where you've been trying to kind of get into this gear of being live and reactive?
Exactly. Actually, I would say, Annie, we're still in the assessment phase. We are trying to understand what are the current unique stressors and the triggers causing emotional toll on the employees. But based on the clinical observation that we are having and the one-on-ones and the interviews that we are having with the moderators, there are two aspects of it. The one is the anxiety stem from the fact that there is still very blurry, undecisive, and very unexpectedness part of it happening. So when we are having these interactions with the employees, they don't know what to expect from the policies, from the content that they're reviewing. At the same time, they don't know actually from their own communities how to interact and engage with each other and how to talk and handle the situation. It is changing everyday basis. That is related and correlated with anxiety. We see a lot of fight, flight, and freeze response in our employees every single day, and trying to proactively to assess these stressors and implement some mental health interventions right away to mitigate the potential risk about anxiety. The second part of it, I would talk about some depressive and helplessness symptomology, because trauma is not only happening when you experience that hard situation. When you observe someone else's trauma, our mirror neurons, maybe I would go a little bit clinical, but in the brain is activated, that you experience that trauma over somebody else's trauma. Watching the crisis and the harm, egregiousness, and the horrible stuff happening in Ukraine and the war, that you experience that through other people's pain. So that is causing some helplessness, don't know how to support, how to mitigate the unfortunateness of the situation. This is the second aspect that is related with depression, that we are actually anticipating some depressive and traumatic symptomology in the future as a kind of effect in the long-term basis. And another one that I like to mention is policies are changing so fast, and it's not easy, even in a normal basis, to keep up with these policies. In that crises, our moderators, I would say, speaking of the concentric spaces, actually don't know how to keep it up. And there is a cognitive nuance of it, which we call information interference, that the old knowledge interfere with your new knowledge, that when you learn something new, you don't know how to implement these new policies. That would cause some performance issues. That would cause some maybe delays in your action. That is related with your day-to-day operations. That is also require a lot of human-centric coaching that we shouldn't neglect in the content moderation space nowadays. It doesn't have to be technical, has to be empathetic, has to be actually opening space to mirrors and mistakes and some human-related issues. So this is what I see.
Karen, does that resonate with you, that over the last 30-odd days, the content might be different, but you have the tooling, the systems are still the same? Is the emotional toll, though, different on fact-checkers day-to-day over the last 30-odd days?
I think, Bahar, you make some excellent points, and ones that I was going to make myself. We're still very much in the middle of this. It has been an incredibly intense 30 days for our fact checkers. And also, I think we need to look at this in that there is the unexpected. We didn't expect this. We woke up one morning and this was in front of us, and that's how it's been every day since. But there's also a cumulative effect of this, right? We've been doing this work now for 5 years. The last 5 years have been incredibly intense and difficult and have taken an amazing toll on our staff. And I think, we coming through the 2020 election, coronavirus, which was an avalanche of misinformation, and now this. And so I think, it's not just, we have to get the work done. There's an incredible amount of work to do. It's extremely difficult to fact check. Many of our fact checkers are based in the United States, so we're working on a different time zone, working in different languages. We do have people on the ground there, but it's very, very difficult for us to do this work and to ensure that what we're doing is 100% accurate. And so I think, a lot of the things that we're doing on the team is really initiating conversations to check in with the staff and ask how they're doing, and to give them breaks, to encourage them to take time away from their screens, to vary the assignments that they get so that they're not always focused on the very difficult imagery that they wake up to. And I think that's really helping. But I think the fact is that while we can do all of this, we won't really know the emotional toll, I think, for some time. Right now, we're just trying to get through it. And I think, it might be a while before we see what sort of impact this has had on our employees.
Yeah, it's survival mode. Ben, something you and I have been reflecting on inside Kinzen, and I'm sure it's the same for fact checkers, Concentrix, the platforms, is the two modes that we've all had to go into in recent weeks, which is how do you protect the get ahead to the next elections, make sure we're still future-proofing, thinking about what's to come, the noble things Katie talked about, and yet find a place where you're in the moment, live, reactive. So there's these two modes. So one, I'm kind of curious to see how you think that's playing out, whether it's fact checkers, Kinzen, platforms. But two, at the start, the media analysis, the commentary was, yeah, the platforms are on this, they've got it, they're being reactive, they're taking their responsibilities seriously. Do you think that has changed the longer we've gone in, that we're starting to understand the real world impact of some of those decisions a few weeks ago?
I think so I write a newsletter called Everything in Moderation, for those that don't know, which is about content moderation, the evolution of this space. And I've been doing that since 2018, since before content moderation was cool, before it became an interesting topic for people. And I think what I've seen is, yes, there has been a change in tone in the last 30 days. I think you had a situation where tech bloggers and tech writers were surprised with the speed with which platforms did something. And that was new, right? There's been plenty of incidents in Myanmar, in Ethiopia, where platforms have not responded with the speed that they did now. And so tech bloggers were like, that's great, there's some positives to take there. Naturally, there are some complexities with that. There are reasons why platforms did that and they didn't do that in these other parts of the world, which I'm sure, as Karen says, we'll get into. But you also had a situation where President Zelensky was praising the actions of Meta as well, a month into the conflict. And so you had a situation where there was a positivity around the platforms, which I think has started to become a bit more misty. People are less sure of that now. We are still very much in the early stages. We don't know when this is going to finish. And we're only going to be able to see it looking back with a good chunk of time to be able to reflect and analyze. And so I would be very reluctant to make any kind of decision and any kind of call as to whether the platforms have done a good job or a bad job at this point in time. It's very much too early to say. And then just the point on the trust and safety teams, did some work with Kinzen last year where I spoke to trust and safety folks, people who are at the coalface, and they are constantly in crisis mode. You cannot underestimate, if you are on the outside as a journalist, as many people at this festival are, the constant crisis nature of the work they do. I do interviews with these people and they say, I literally open my laptop and I'm scared about what I find. And that's, I know everyone has that to an extent, but we cannot underestimate the difficulty of doing your job when you have a crisis on your hand, and yet you have to prepare for elections in France, Philippines, Brazil within the next, 6 to 12 months.
Speaking of those elections, Katie, take us back to a bar in Washington, D.C. in 2020, when you were starting to look at all of the elections between then and 2024 and realising, my goodness, there's a huge geopolitical moment ahead of us. And the thought process you went through, the decisions you made, and 2 years in, where do you think we're at in terms of the worst case scenario as you saw it for 2024?
Yeah, you're showing my election geekness. I basically have an election calendar that's been in my head for many, many years now. And in 2020, I was trying to think through a new role for myself at the company, which is a longer story for another time. But every 5 years, the world sort of has a big number of elections that happen. It happened in 2014, half the world went to polls. It happened in 2019. And so I was thinking forward to 2024, and I realized that not only were we going to have the US presidential election that year, but India was going to go to the polls, Indonesia, Ukraine, Taiwan, Mexico, the United Kingdom, and the European Parliament, amongst a bunch of others that will be happening as well. And I was like, this feels bigger than even 2014 and 2019. And so, again, being the geek that I went back to India's first elections around 1950, 1952. And this collection of countries have never gone to the polls together in the same time. And I was thinking ahead of how we were going to have, regulation was obviously starting to be introduced. So by, 4 years later, we were going to have different tech regulation. I had no idea what was coming at us for the next 2 years around COVID, around racial justice, around the war in Ukraine, but also, too, in terms of how much people's use of these platforms are shifting. It's shifting from broadcasting on Facebook to using messenger platforms. You have issues of encryption. You have newer platforms that, like TikTok and Telegram, that you're hearing more and more of. And that decentralization is going to make it harder for people to monitor what is happening. And then you have all those countries' elections that are happening, that there's so many fronts that we're going to have to be dealing with all at the same time, that it's going to take a huge toll on employees. It's going to take a huge toll on leadership. It's going to take a huge toll on the media covering it, civil society covering it, academia who's trying to figure out what's happening, that I worry that if we don't start thinking about it now, that we're not going to be ready, and it's going to leave some really wide gaps for bad actors to potentially exploit these different platforms. And that's on top of the fact that you have Silicon Valley rushing towards new technologies like Web3 and crypto and NFTs and all of that. And I'm a little worried, and I want to make sure that, yes, I want to make sure we continue to innovate, but that doesn't mean we're abandoning these platforms that are still being used by billions of people. And like Ben said, that's not to mention all the elections happening this year. Yeah. And what's happening. And there's starting to be, in France, it's small, but themes starting to emerge around whether or not the election can be trusted. And if it should be a stop the steal thing, which is sort of, I don't know if the platforms were necessarily expecting that.
Do you think the state of readiness has changed? Like we've seen from Facebook statistics before that suggested that 90% of the investment when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, disruption, detection was in English-speaking content, and yet the amount of users is 9% on Facebook who use English as their first language. Do you think that has shifted, that there is now a state of readiness to go into like dozens of different languages in elections world over?
Not to my knowledge, but it's something I'm keeping a close eye on. Typically when I was there, we had my team that was doing, so on sort of the public policy partnership side, there was a lot of work around, and the operations side. The real question is where the product team is able to put their focus and how many resources there are on the product team to build the proactive classifiers to try to find hate speech, to try to find electoral misinformation, to try to create those things like labels, to find the partners to do it, to do the translations. Like, there are a lot of steps that have to go into those types of things. And I have been keeping pretty close track. In Brazil, the platforms have been doing labels because Bolsonaro has long been questioning whether or not the electoral process will be legitimate. They didn't have that in France. Maybe that'll be okay, because maybe it's not going to be as big of a thing, but I'm a little nervous about that. They do have a team working on that in the Philippines. So I don't know. I hope they are. Part of the reason I'm trying to talk about this so far in advance is to try to help people to be realizing it, because they may not even realize how many of those elections are happening, and maybe they'll at least start thinking about it and start putting some of those things in place.
Bahar, I guess a similar question to you in terms of that proactive planning and seeing it play out for trust and safety teams in multiple languages, and understanding the different challenges, you know, the volume challenge you're going to have in one country, the nuances in a different language. Like, how much do you see platforms getting ahead of that to understand it? And then Concentrix state of readiness for it as well.
Exactly. Maybe I can start with emphasizing, and my worry about, do we accurately and greatly assess the stressors in that work? And it is all the time changing. It's not actually set in stone. It is different in every country. It is different for every geography. And also age, gender, upbringings, your culture changes everything. So maybe I can pinpoint some common stressors that we have been seeing with our researchers and clinical teams. One, not being able to talk about the essence of the work. Sometimes it is seen as a dirty job. It is seen as just that you need to hide that, and you don't have to necessarily talk about it in the public. It's causing some emotional toll, and it is a common in every geography. It doesn't change as in, let's say, Indonesia to States. If you're hiding something, this is causing some, of course, a stress, natural stress. The second one is actually that we need to put a lot of emphasis on the prolonged exposure. And I want to actually answer your question, how much emphasis we put on tool development and tool investments. Within Concentrix, yes, we are actually developing some tools about blurring some size, some mitigating and diminishing the maybe just the colors and the pictures, and it is all about just creating some safe space and preventing your exposure time to the content, which is really important. But technology companies, medical technology companies, we have to constantly do the collaboration, to do the investment to technology and tooling, which is really important. Another one is, I am not sure actually how much we are replacing anecdotal feedback with objective data. This is a science and research has to evolve towards that. Within content moderation, we shouldn't rely on only anecdotal feedback moving forward in order to assess stressors and come up with interventions. How we can identify the stressors are, again, through medical technology integration. Within Concentrix, our research studies and research divisions focusing on some trackable heart rate technologies that we are constantly assessing oxytocin level and correlation with psychological safety, engagement activities, because we need to put a lot of emphasis on uniqueness of the individual. The uniqueness actually, how I am perceiving the content, how am I actually integrating with my employees and my staff, how am I actually delivering training, how am I receiving the training, how am I actually feeling within the huddles, team huddles, and while we are processing the content. So it is so important to daily basis understanding the nuances, and we shouldn't take it for granted. Even for the break system, bringing in breaks and offering some interventions during the day, based on what we are offering these technologies. What are the benchmarks? What are the minimum criteria and commonalities that we are seeing among these people? So based on what and research data we are coming up with, that interventions should be our starting point, and we have to invest more on research, technology, innovation, I would say.
Ben, can you talk a little bit, Bahar mentioned their data, and when you were doing the research for Kinzen last year, just that crisis mode, some of the learnings, but particularly the difficulty of measuring progress for content moderators and trust and safety professionals, because sometimes they're doing things that actually never happen. It's the fires that never burn, the fires that never start. And how do you actually measure that preventative action that they were able to take? That has to be more, just in terms of their feeling incentivized and enthused about their work, that has to be really deflating.
I mean, it's a massive, massive issue. And when I think about elections, I ask myself the question, what does success look like? Right? Is it success if there's no Stop the Steal campaign? Is it success if one party wins over another? Is it success if there is a certain level of prevalence of a type of hate? When I speak to the people in the platforms, the people doing this work, the way that they measure their work, and Bahar will speak to this probably better than anyone, but they're measuring it in terms of prevalence, so the kind of percentage of content on the platform. they're measuring it in terms of time, so how quickly we can bring that down, or they're measuring it in terms of action consistency. So does the process that we've set up, did that happen as it should have done? Were we kind of consistent? Did we apply it well? And it's not very easy to make a link between those metrics and something as big as an election. It's really, really difficult to do that. So on a day-to-day basis, if you're part of a team or if you're a head of a team, it's really tough, actually, to say, what can I do today that's going to make that election a free and fair election on our platform? The other things that came up in that research, which I was very surprised about, were not, I struggle to see child pornography, or I struggle with the mental health issues that come with some of these big challenges, which I thought they would be. These are more middle managers than the actual folks doing the content moderation, but they were very concerned about the way that their companies saw their work, the lack of knowledge in their companies about what trust and safety professionals do. We presume that people at the top of Facebook or of Twitter or of any of these platforms understand trust and safety. They don't. And they're incentivized in a way that means that they don't have to really care unless they really have to. And so that's a real difficulty. That's why I think this space is very interesting, is that we get into the realms of how companies exist, whether they are set up in the right way, whether they are, people are incentivized to do the right thing at the time of an election. So once you unpick something, you're unpicking things, left, right, and centre.
Staying with elections, Karen, what do you think were some of the major learnings we had in the United States 2016 and 2020? How it has evolved, the fact-checking space, the relationship with the platforms, and how it has even evolved since 2020, sitting here today in 2022. And in all of that, what you think you've seen in the United States in terms of the playbooks and understanding the different variety of content now, the volumes of it, the nuances that can help us better understand how to tackle elections here in Europe.
I think this is an area that has evolved tremendously from what I've experienced at the Associated Press. I think there are so many learnings. I think we could do a whole panel just on that. But just briefly, I would say that we really had to change the way that we approached the work. We didn't really expect that there would be this much misinformation from 2016 up until today. It has increased tremendously. It has become a lot more savvy. It's become a lot more visual. We really had to increase our resources around visual verification. And really get into a little bit of like forensic science around it, do frame-by-frame analyses of videos and really figure out how to verify the authenticity of images. And this is all quite new for us, really. So we had to learn a lot around that. And then we also had to think about, one, how to prioritize what we were seeing. What was the most important thing for us to go after? What was really resonating with the audience, and what were the key issues and themes? And so we had to really develop ways to get organized about how we did the work itself, and that's I think that's a process really that is still evolving, and also keep in mind we were also balancing the coronavirus and all sorts of other misinformation that was going on all around the world. But I think one of the key things that we also took away from that whole time is that we needed to find different formats, story vehicles to reach people. So we were doing, what we call AP fact checks, where we're basically looking at the statements from public and elected officials and verifying them in a just the facts sort of way. We were doing online debunking of misinformation, in which we were looking at memes, stories, photos, videos, and debunking that, and doing dozens of those every week. And we got to a point where we thought, why is this still what more can we do? And so we came up with new approaches. One was an explainer series that we did, where we really just started taking some of these issues and some of the misinformation and explaining it in very straight language to people. And they took off. I mean, there was an extremely high engagement, and we just didn't know that there was that sort of audience for that, which was amazing. And the other thing that we did was a Q&A, basically, where we took one of the most prevalent questions we saw, what's the deal with mail-in ballots, for example? Was there really fraud in Arizona? Questions like that. And we asked the question and we answered the questions in ways that met people where they are. We used language that was a little bit more casual, but accurate and straight. And those did really well for us too. And they played out really well for us on social. So I think and we're still learning, right? We're still thinking about ways to go about that as we think ahead to midterms, as we think ahead to the French election, and what sort of themes and issues and topics are going to come up around that, and how do we get organized around that, and also the next presidential election.
Bahar, Karen mentioned there the process of prioritization, and I wonder, how do you and your team approach that? Like, you're looking at a heat map of the world and you can see Philippines, Myanmar, India, Kenya, all of these elections, Mexico, United States, and how do you teach that prioritization when it comes to just where there is the greatest risk, where is the greatest need, where your platform partners need to go? Like, how do you do that, one, and empower people to make decisions and prioritize one viral sensation over another, one country meme over another? It must be incredibly difficult and complex.
Exactly. Cultural sensitivity is the part of it. Am I open? Yeah. Cultural sensitivity is the part of our training process. Maybe I can talk about a little bit about the bias and the sensitivity aspect of it. When we onboard the moderator, it is a life cycle. Like, from day one to offboarding is just employee life cycle. And the training and the coaching aspect is very crucial and required. And through one-on-one reach and also maybe group support, from day one, we are supporting our employees through teaching them what are your cultural nuances in that certain region, and who you are as a person, how you can be more aware and generate more self-awareness towards yourself and your culture in order to make accurate decisions. Because we are all human beings and bringing up our own biases and prejudices about everything. I would be a moderator from Russia and moderating the content about war, that I have to give accurate decision and put my biases aside. It is not an easy work. So not only wellness teams, but also we are putting well-being or even awareness in every aspect of moderation. Quality teams, operations teams, they have to be more aware of how they need to support their staff when they see some prejudiced behaviors. This is one. The secondly, cultural aspect, region to region. The prioritization needs to be made by, of course, the companies, the policies. Policies should be very cultural sensitive, and how they need to educate the staff members also given by the companies some methodology. Even the facilitator's behavior play a role here. How a trainer and a facilitator reach out to the staff member and teach them the priorities that they need to put in place. Some personality aspect needs to be part of it. Gen Z acts different than millennials. They learn differently. So we need to take under consideration age differences, gender differences, cultural nuances, everything's that kind of coming as a capsule when we are teaching people these nuances, that I would say.
Katie, do you think with everything Bahar is talking about there that we need more transparency about that thought process, one, but two, then, just when it comes to elections in general, do you get the sense, and is there enough transparency around just all of these what-if scenarios, you know, and the threat mitigations, and, well, if X politician says Y, well, then content moderators know this is the playbook, we're going to pull out and do A, B, C?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. One, I think it's important to not only think about it from the operations and content moderation side, but also from the product side. Do the people building the products have the language capabilities, the cultural sensitivities, the understandings around bias and everything like that? Because I think sometimes when we have this conversation, that is an area that gets, they kind of talk past one another, because people are like, Facebook doesn't, or this company doesn't have enough language capabilities. And I'm like, the operations teams have a ton. The product teams don't have a lot. And that's where you kind of want to focus on a lot of that. And I do think some more transparency and data around that to help external researchers and others to be able to see what is happening as well. And, you know, we partner with, like, for instance, we've done a lot, I keep saying we, it was 10 years at the company, so the blue runs a little deep. It takes me a while sometimes to get out of it. I apologize. But when I was there, and Facebook Meta still does this, works with one organization, they work with a lot, but one is Atlantic Council's DFR lab, Digital Forensics Research Lab. And there were many other partners as well that were huge in terms of sometimes flagging things to us. And so more transparency around that can be really key. To your questions around the decision makings and the what ifs, I do think there should be more, if you ever want to go through a very fascinating but scary exercise, do a threat ideation exercise. Where you look at a particular event that's coming, it could be an election, it could be something you're not, like okay, if war breaks out, if China invades Taiwan, or something like that, how might that play out? Where might there be gaps in our policies? Where might there be things that we need to do now? You should certainly, I think, more of those should be done, but it is near impossible to predict with incredible accuracy exactly what's going to unfold when things happen. And so where I would also like to see a bit more transparency is, what are the values that these leaders are using when evaluating these situations and making these decisions around whether it's deplatforming a sitting president, prime minister, or whomever it might be, whether it is how you're dealing with state media and other things, because I think that black box of a decision-making process, who is in the room, who's making the ultimate decision, this gives people a lot of anxiety because they don't quite understand what it is and how they're weighing those different trade-offs when they do so.
Ben, do you think the transparency obligations on platforms is going to change, that this is going to be a whole new area we're going to talk about under the banner of regulation?
I think there's definitely going to be more transparency. I think regulation will do that. The DSA definitely has transparency aspects in it. The Online Safety Bill in the UK also alludes to it in parts. The question for me is, to what benefit is transparency? It's one thing that I definitely agree with Katie, that there should be a greater awareness of the decisions that are being made. But at the same time, the data we've seen platforms put out so far, I don't think is very good. It's not very consistent. It's very much on their terms. You cannot compare apples to apples, which I think is where we start to get very powerful. Understanding what platforms are doing and how they work against each other. So actually, for what end is transparency? And I think it's used as a kind of catch-all term in kind of the solutions for some of these challenges, but I don't know if it's necessarily going to deliver as it stands. Obviously, our understanding of transparency will get better. So right now, I'm not super hopeful, but fingers crossed we can get there.
Staying with regulation, Katie, you wrote recently, government is not designed to move as fast as technology is created. By the time laws are introduced, debated and passed, the technology they were originally regulating is likely very out of date. That leaves us with, in this moment where we're trying to be real and reactive, platforms are making decisions in the short term. We don't yet understand, to Karen's point earlier, the medium to long-term impacts. Government is also trying to monitor, react, and yet it's never going to be able to keep pace with the speed of change in technology. How much does that concern you in terms of the speed dials there? And what do you think ultimately is going to be the role in regulation to force through some of the necessary transparency you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's, some of it's the nature of how government is meant to be. It's meant to be more slow and deliberative. And my hope would be we would be able to get to a spot where we potentially have some sort of, there's plenty of other industries that are regulated that have regular oversight and things of that nature, that maybe we can get to a place where we have a bit more of a quicker turnaround time oversight. Part of it, too, is that the generation that the lawmakers and policymakers are in is completely different than the one that the tech workers are in. I currently, when I talk to policymakers and staff, they laugh about things about the metaverse. They roll their eyes when I bring up crypto and NFT. And I was like, no, you did that about Twitter and Facebook. I was in the room when you did it. So, now you're worried about it 10 years later. Maybe we should. But it is really hard. They have so many other issues to deal with that for them, too, how do you, the education component of it, is something that, and one of the encouraging things I'm seeing, and I think has been an important change with not just Frances Haugen, but I've seen also with some of my other former coworkers that worked at least at Facebook, in integrity, we recently created something called the Integrity Institute to try to support some of those workers. We are being inundated with requests from people who want folks that have worked at these companies, that understand how they work, can speak to it in a way that does not violate their NDAs, but better helps them to understand that. And it's not, as much as I love my public policy colleagues, we are not engineers, we're not data scientists, we're not the researchers. And so we can share one component of that, but having those people that were actually on the ground to be able to help them to better understand how to make better regulation, stuff like that, has been, I think, a positive change in the last, year-ish or so, that I feel like I have to remain hopeful, because otherwise I'm just going to be sitting in the corner crying. But to me, that that gives me hope that maybe eventually we will be able to figure it out.
Go for it.
I just want to come in on the kind of speed question, and I think, I don't know how you would disagree or what other panelists were thinking, but the speed with which technology companies move is a thing of their own creation.
Yes.
Right? It's not something that is embedded in technology companies. It's a competitive advantage. Mark Zuckerberg made it up in his room in Stanford that he was going to move fast and break things. And over the last decade, he has withdrawn from that position, right? So he now talks about, bringing people together and, forming communities. And so this is a thing of their own creation. And we should, I think, put emphasis and pressure on technology companies to act more like lawmakers, because when you think about it, specifically in this content moderation space, they are lawmakers. They are people in a room weighing up risks, using words to define concepts, and then passing those things down to other people to put into practice. That's lawmaking, right? And the fact is, we see it as something different, and we treat it very differently to the way that we treat lawmakers. We don't have as much oversight. There are no subcommittees for assessing content moderation policies. Depending on what you think about the oversight board. So there needs to be a kind of, I think if we move in that direction, then actually we will be in a better place than if we allow tech companies to kind of plow their own furrow.
Yeah, if I could just say two things to that. One would be, I 100% agree. Two, then the questions would be as well, what speed bumps can government put into place to maybe help force some of that slowing down? And also, how do we put more pressure on the VC community and the funders of these things that they actually need to put, how do you do responsible growth? We don't talk enough about what responsible growth should look like. We don't talk enough about how they can do that and how they can do so that, if they're doing it but their competitor is not, and their competitor ends up winning over them, that is a really difficult incentive structure for them. You kind of have to do something to make it an even playing field.
The thing that strikes me, because you're also thoughtful about an area that is so complex then, is how we're at an international festival of journalism and how the media rises to meet this moment. And in the rush sometimes for speed, how maybe there isn't enough nuance, education, thoughtfulness, understanding of this whole area. And Bahar, I wonder, is that something that you and your team are a little bit discouraged about sometimes, is that there isn't enough of an understanding of just how complex everything is that we've just talked about for the last 40 minutes, and what more can be done to educate media and therefore the public alike?
Exactly, and you reminded me actually, one aspect of the blind side of this work is repetitiveness and the monotony, that sometimes discouragement is a really correct word, that we would feel the discouragement that there is some certain area set in stone and we don't have any power to change anything, or being a thought leader or change managers in this space, that we are just, as Ben mentioned, lawmaking is there and we are just executing stuff. There is a discrepancy in between them. We want to actually be more active participants to change stuff, even sharing our vision and sharing our decisions and even our point of view to cause some brainstorming. And it's the feedback loop that we are hoping to create. Otherwise, this is just a kind of execution work that is very dull. And it is also when there is no creativity, when there is no change management involved, it is causing a lot of errors as well, and maybe transparency is impacted, or when there is even the actions are impacted. So this is one aspect of it. And the second one, as you mentioned, what would be the ideal scenario is just the lean management. At the same time, maybe some thought leadership in that space. Why do we not actually do more collaboration altogether? Why are we not getting involved to research and innovation altogether? It doesn't have to be competition. It should be just a collaboration altogether to make the space more even comprehensive and evolving in the future. This is my vision.
Karen, is that something you've seen, that there is a greater space for not only fact checkers to collaborate, because I think there's a really good legacy of that, but deeper collaborations through platforms, startups like Kinzen, that everybody has similar intent and that there's a willingness, let's not compete here, let's collaborate. Because of what Bahar is talking about there, this willingness and this desire to have power to change and have an impact. And so it is about the greater good.
It is about the greater good. I think, it's a tricky question because I come from a news agency that is unbiased and committed to accurate reporting. But I do think that there is space for that collaboration, and certainly we've had a lot of really good discussions about what we can all be doing collectively to make this better, including with Kinzen. And we do a lot of that work. I mean, we work with a lot of organizations that are doing amazing work in the misinformation space, and we have really good, candid conversations about ways that we can, come up with new methods and also just, some of the challenges that we are facing. And it's amazing that through these conversations, there's some real commonalities. And so I think there is a lot that we can be doing together collectively. And you're right, there's a tremendous amount of collaboration among fact checkers, even though we're sometimes competing against each other, often, always actually. But there's a real camaraderie in this group. So.
Ben, before we come to Magic Wand solutions and questions from the audience, so we are going to come to you. Ben, can you comment just on your perception of media coverage of this entire space of trust and safety and content moderation? And is it nuanced enough?
I think it's terrible, actually.
Tell us how you really feel.
We were talking about it just before the panel, actually. I mean, first of all, I just want to kind of add to what Bahar said about working together. I think platforms really don't see that by nature of the way that they're kind of structured and their incentives that they set up on this, the fact that they report to stakeholders at the end of the shareholders at the end of the day. If one network solves the problems that we've been talking about today, that doesn't matter, because the problems will still exist in a number of other different platforms. It's the movement between those platforms and the problems that persist will happen until the end of time, until companies can work out how they work together. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing, as far as the coverage of this stuff goes, and obviously I pay very close attention. I write this weekly newsletter where I round up everything that's going on in the industry, and what I see is this kind of setup, this artificial setup between publishers and platforms. Still, we are almost 20 years into that setup, and it is boring. And again, commercially motivated, I presume. Publishers have had their lunch eaten by these platforms. There is a resentment there. They no longer have the distribution that they once did. But it is boring, and we need to get out of that cycle to begin with. I think there's also the technology lens. There's a very technology-focused aspect to the coverage rather than the kind of policy operations aspect of it, which we've heard today is actually fascinating. There are elements of mental health in there, of speech, of the future of work. It's a real melting pot of different issues. And when you read the coverage of even some of the best journalists who cover this issue, that is lost. And so, the expertise that you have on the panel here is reduced to one or two quotes in the second to last paragraph of a story. So I think we do need to get better at raising up the voices of people who do this work. It's great that people from kind of who are in platforms who are now stepping out are prepared to talk. I think credit to Katie for that, and also for Bahar, somebody working in a BPO, for coming on a panel and facing some of these difficult conversations, because that also is necessary.
So to leave people with some sense of hope, particularly for the future of our democracies, Katie, and we're still thinking to 2024, and we have to hope there's proactivity, we're getting into a state of readiness, investment in the right areas. But let's say you had the magic wand effect, where you had endless budget, tooling, resources. Like, what are some of the things? There's long-term investments, and then there's quick wins. Like, what are some of the quick wins that platforms could be thinking about with their trust and safety teams today?
And I have unlimited budget, and I have all the people who have the talent. Because I do want to say that we say that jokingly, but I think sometimes people do think these platforms have unlimited funds. Yeah. And they do have a lot of money, and we should have that question, but they are not unlimited. But it's actually also a challenge of finding people who have these expertise. These are new challenges. These are new things that have, many of which that have emerged just over the last 5 years or so, that many of us have been learning on the job of how to do. And so it is not as simple as just being, let's hire more people and let's get more money. So I just want to say, even as we say it in jest, and I'll take it, it has its own complications. I think you need teams, depending on the size of the country and the complications that they're in, and it could be hundreds of people, it could be just, 50 to 75, depending upon, again, the size of the country. We usually, when I was at Facebook, we would start about 1.5 to 2 years out of any election, doing risk assessments, doing research, trying to pull the teams together. And I think that, what was helpful with that was that people within, they'd be thinking long term, they're not dealing with crisis to crisis to crisis, then they would go into that rapid response mode as the election got closer. And then you would try to move them to another election that's about 2 years to 1.5 years out to try to give a little bit of that break. Because if you had people going from election to election to election, that burn is so draining. It's so draining. And the pressure they feel of knowing that they've done some work, but there's so much more work to be done, I don't care what age you are, but it was real debilitating. It was debilitating for me. Yeah. It was really rough. And so I think taking the time to put in those structures into place of understanding, and every platform's different, of what you need to do, and think about preparing now for that, because that can be, they got some of these teams in place for Philippines, they got these things in place for Brazil in the midterms, and now it's that you're doing this stuff for the new ones. Help to manage expectations of when they're actually going to be able to announce, when they're putting different things into place, when they're doing it. We should be honest about the fact they can't do everything at once. And then we do have to have that question about success. I ask people that a ton. How do you define success? Because it is unrealistic to expect that we're going to get to 0% harm. It's unrealistic to expect that they can do every single thing in every single country. And these are some of the really, really tough questions nobody really wants to talk about, because they're not like, no one wants to talk about those types of things, but we need to a bit more out in the open, because otherwise, whoever's gonna be the first mover in terms of framing these things as they come out of it, and whether or not it's success. And I do worry sometimes people view it as success of one party winning over the other. And I personally don't think that's the accurate one. So I don't have a perfect menu of things that I would do, but that would be how I would start to approach it.
Bahar, magic wand.
I was thinking actually, instead of having a top-down process, also getting bottom-up process involved too. So maybe moderators, making a long-term plan about elections and everything. Moderators are the ones who are evaluating everything daily basis, and their feedback and their opinion also matters a lot. What I am seeing, however, is the top-down approach, that the policies or the preparation is made by the companies and the managers and all the lawmakers. And we forget actually to hear more about how it was landed to people. What is their feedback? I think the feedback cycle and the process and the preparation can be more enhanced by getting top-down involved. This is what I would add.
Ben?
I would it's something very subtle. I don't know what the price of this would be, but I'd like companies to not see kind of trust and safety as a cost center, right? So when you create a cost center and you say that a group of people who are doing their utmost to try and keep harm off a platform, when you put a budget against them, you limit them. And so I've had conversations with people who request a tool And that tool is going to help them in an upcoming election or will help them for their next 12 months' work. And because they're a cost center and they're competing against other cost centers, they lose out. And so you have a situation where they don't have the people or the tools or the resources to do the job that they think they do. And so I would love, again, very magic wand, but I'd love for platforms to say, okay, you have unlimited money to go and do what you need to do.
We'll price that for you later.
Yeah.
And Karen?
These are all great answers. I would just say that I would love to see within the fact-checking community exactly, basically what Ben said, but for fact-checkers, more tools and more resources and more collaboration and more support. Transparency from the platforms would be nice too.
Is there anything, just on the tooling one, because I feel like this comes up, like is there anything is like high on the wish list of tooling for fact checkers that, again, unlimited resources and engineers and developers could go off and do it? Like, what would you love?
I would love any sort of tool that makes it faster. I really would when it comes to
Speed
verification.
to detection, just to knowing where...
Absolutely, particularly around visuals. I would love that, sorry.
I'd add live audio and video and ephemeral content and across more platforms. Like the tooling, like having all of that is just like, I would imagine not just for fact checkers, I don't want to speak for you all, but I hear it a lot from other organizations and others who are trying to track this. If you're only doing text-based, you're not getting the breadth of what is happening out there.
Yeah, cross-platform and all of the various different formats. Something we think a lot about in Kinzen. Audience questions. Does anyone have a question? We have 5 minutes still to go. Yeah, gentleman here at the front. And I'll repeat your question back for our audience watching in.
Sure. Hi. Thanks for a very informative panel. You mentioned speed. I was wondering if at Facebook or AP, or if you're aware or would like to see, or see any opportunities for AI. I mean, AI like Google was sort of 10 years ago that would be called an AI. But anything between that and super advanced machine learning, up to and including, to be able to at first just detect when a disinformation thing appearing on your platform and saying, okay, this is something that we need to look at. Do you see opportunities for that being used?
And just for our online audience, so the question is around speed and the role of AI, machine learning, engineering to help with the detection. Who'd like to go first there? Ben?
Well, there is a panel actually at 6:30 p.m. today, which I'm part of, where we will talk some of these issues. So I would say that, generally speaking, I think there is obviously a role for this. There's a huge amount of people are starting to call kind of safety tech, of which detecting misinformation is a part of. So there are many startups trying to solve for this issue. I think we will see a consolidation of those technology companies over time. They will be bought up, but it's a growing space, lots of, huge amounts of revenue. I would say that I would like the emphasis to be amplifying the work of humans rather than doing this on its own. I think if you start to, if you're a founder of a company or doing this kind of AI work and you're not, essentially empowering humans and creating systems that are black box, that are very hard to understand, very hard to audit, then actually we're at risk of adding to the problem that we already face.
And also, can I add the limitation in language as well? If I had a wish list, I would actually add the language diversity to that AI developments. Because fun fact about me, I did content moderation actually ages ago. I'm not going to disclose my age, but when I did that for some languages that was like Arabic, Turkish, very weak AI still being used in that some regions. So it is maybe growing for English language, but there is improvement needed for other languages.
Great. No one else on that. Next audience question. We'll take a quick one here.
You mentioned we can't get to 100%. Why should we still work in this area? Because I also meet this demotivating attitude, like, we can't fix this. Why should we keep fighting and do something about it?
So the question there really is about persistence and resilience. Yeah.
So while I don't think we can get to zero, I think we can get better. I think we've seen that over time across a lot of different industries, and I think that the internet's not going away, the platforms aren't going away, technology isn't going away, and I guess I would just rather try to continue. I find the problems fascinating. They're hard, but I find them fascinating to try to think about and work on. And so I think it's just really important that I think it's something we have to do, because if we don't do it, I don't like the thought of the world of what that looks like without even trying.
Can I just quickly add to that? In real life, the risk is not zero, right? When we're going around in our world, there is a risk of something happening to us now. We're pretty safe, but there's always a risk of something happening, right? You cross the road, you might get hit by a car. The risk is never zero, and from the people I talk to in the trust and safety space, they are very cognizant of that. That we can reduce things to as minimal a level as possible. We should definitely aim to do that, but it's never going to be zero. And that's a very key piece of understanding when we're talking about these things, when we're reporting on them. And I think that's just really, really key to know. If you're a child in a room, you don't get rid of the plug sockets completely, but you put a cover over them so you don't get electrocuted. I think that's the kind of things that we're talking about as an industry of introducing.
Okay, we want very, very quick question. Thank you.
As somebody who led product policy for trends at Twitter, I think this panel was spot on, so thank you so much. My question is, do you guys have a wish list of any mental health resources, whether it's for tech workers, content moderators, or journalists covering these issues?
So wish list of resources on mental health. Bahar, do you want to jump in there?
Definitely. Actually, I mentioned before, but my wish list would be on more data-oriented and objective data collection and more research and university collaborations, I would say. I'm wishing to see more PhD studies and research studies in universities. I see trust and safety job as a kind of cognitive lab that we need to focus on more cognitive science, attention, retention of memory, cognitive abilities, not only mental health effect and long-term trauma, but it's also daily basis information processing in the brain. So I would say research at universities, medical technology collaborations, more objective data collection through maybe devices and medical resources would be my 3 wish list.
Anyone else want to add there? Yeah, Katie?
I would just add too, I think it's important to also think about how do you provide those resources for the frontline workers? What does that look like for the managers? And I've also been thinking a lot too, like this also does take a toll of the people at the very top of the company. They too have been going through these crises for a long period of time. And I don't think we've thought enough about how COVID and other things has actually impacted them, and how does that impact decision making at the very top as well.
Okay, great. Bahar, Katie, Ben, Karen, thank you so much for that. To our audience here, thank you so much for joining us, and the online audience. Thank you so much, everyone. Well done. Thank you very much, folks. That was